Hi again and welcome back. In this video, we're going to be looking at the imperfect tense in Greek. This is imperfective aspect in past time. There are two perspectives that we can take on the past in Greek, and so there are two different past tenses in Greek. The first we've looked at, the aorist tense, and at least in the indicative mood, it indicates past time in general, and so we have the augment at the beginning. But the aorist tense also has a simple aspect. In other words, the action is being viewed as a whole, and there's no particular emphasis on any one part of the action or any dimension of the action. It just happens. With the imperfect tense, again, we indicate past time by adding the augment at the beginning. But the imperfective aspect is taken on the action, very much like the present tense. So instead of the action being viewed as one simple whole, now it's like we're standing close up to the train and watching the individual cars whipping by. We're focusing on the continuous nature of the action, on its motion, or on it approaching us, on it beginning. The forms of the imperfect are closely related to the present tense. Really, this is just a way of adding past time to a present tense verb, and so we always use the present tense stem. There's no stem change at all. And there's no extra tense marker, nothing like the sigma of the first aorist. Past time is indicated just by the augment and the endings. But the endings look just like the endings of the second aorist. They're, again, the secondary personal endings. The personal endings used for tenses that receive an augment. Here are the parts of an imperfect active verb. We have the augment at the beginning, indicating past time. We have the stem, in this case lu for luo. No tense marker, and our regular omicron or epsilon connecting vowel, depending on what person and number we're looking at. And then the secondary personal endings. So we have complete forms like eluon and elueta. As you probably remember, our primary active personal endings look like this. In the singular first person, there's no ending, just the connecting vowel which might lengthen. The second person ending is a sigma. The third person ending is an iota. And in the plural we have men, te, and nc, which often becomes usi or asi, depending on the connecting vowel. Our secondary active personal endings, as we saw when we looked at the aorist active indicative, goes like this. In the singular first person, it's a nu, and it's also a nu in the third person plural. So the first person singular and third person plural are going to look the same. Then in the second person, we once again have the sigma ending, and in the third person, there's no ending. The form will just end with the connecting vowel, although there can be a movable nu tacked on the end there for as an aid for pronunciation. In the plural, we have men and te again, but as I said, just the nu ending, which comes in the third person plural. So let's look at the example of luo in the imperfect active indicative. The first person singular will be eluon, and then elues, and elue, or eluen. In the plural, we'll have eluamen, elueta, and eluon. And notice again, eluon is in the first person singular, and eluon, identical form, is in the third person plural. So we really have to just look at context to distinguish whether an imperfect is first person singular or third person plural. As you can see, though, there's no surprise here. We make all of these forms just by taking the present stem of the verb, adding the augment on the beginning, keeping the regular connecting vowel, either omicron or epsilon, and adding on the secondary active endings that we did with the aorist verbs. Here are the parts of an imperfect middle passive verb, and as you can see, really the pattern for forming the imperfect in the middle passive is just the same as it was for the active. We have an augment because we're in the indicative mood and indicating past time. We use the present stem. There's no tense marker, and our regular omicron or epsilon connecting vowel. Then we have personal endings tacked on the end, and once again these are the secondary personal endings, but now the secondary middle passive endings. So we end up with forms like eluamein and eluesthe. Again, to jog your memory, here are the primary middle passive endings: mai, sai, tai, methe, esthe, and tai. And the secondary middle passive endings looked like this: main, sa, ta, methe, esthe, and enta. And as with the primary middle passive endings, the sa of the second person singular often transforms quite a bit because the sigma drops out often between the two vowels, the vowel at the end of the stem and the omicron following. Here are some examples of luo in the imperfect middle passive indicative: eluamein, eluu, elueta, eluamethe, eluesthe, and eluanta. You can notice, same thing we saw before, that this is a very regular set of forms. The augment at the beginning, the present stem, omicron or epsilon connecting vowel, and then the secondary middle passive endings. Just notice in the second person singular how that saw has changed. The sigma has dropped out, and the omicron of saw has combined with the omicron connecting vowel to form the diphthong u. So the actual second person singular middle passive form is eluu. So what's the meaning of the imperfect tense? Well, it uses the same imperfective or continuous aspect as the present tense. This takes a close-up view of the action, focusing on how the action is somehow extended or made continuous. But it can be extended in different ways. And in the present tense, we talked about continuous presence, inceptive presence, iterative, and habitual presence. And we have the same variety of uses of the imperfect tense. Eblepon, from blepo, could mean I was seeing, continuous, or I began to see, inceptive, or I saw repeatedly, I saw over and over, iterative. Or the habitual sense would be I usually saw, or I often saw. How do we know which of these senses to use when we're reading and translating the imperfect tense? We just have to look at context and make an educated guess about which sense of the imperfect is most appropriate from the context. If we want to take a middle passive example, the first thing we need to remember is that just like with present tense verbs, imperfect tense verbs use the same forms for the middle and the passive, unlike aorist, which are going to have separate passive forms. So elegeta could be middle or it could be passive, but we're going to take it as passive here. This is from Lego, and it's a third person singular. So if we take it in a continuous sense, we might translate it, it was being said. If it's inceptive, we might say, it began to be said, or it started to be said. Iterative, we might translate it, it was said repeatedly. It was said over and over. Habitual, we might say, it was usually said, or it was often said. So you can see that with the passive forms of the imperfect, we need to keep in mind both the fact that it's a past tense and the fact that it's got this continuous aspect and the fact that it's passive in voice. You can learn more about the imperfect tense in Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek.